All right, welcome back, Lolo. How have you been?
Doing good. I am hanging in there. I am hanging in there. And you, my dear friend Perry?
I think hanging in there is a good word for it. The last few weeks have been crazy. I really want to apologize to our audience for not having something out between issues, travel issues, a whole bunch of jet lag. I was basically useless until about today, and
Yeah. We had a
I
loss in our family. My grandfather passed away, so we have been doing that. So it's been a
yes,
very exciting few weeks.
yeah. Sorry to hear that, Lolo. It's never any fun losing a grandparent, and yeah.
Thank you. I
Uh,
appreciate that.
All right. Well, should we talk about something really fun and with much levity?
Yes, please.
Namely, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Book of Mormon's case against polygamy. So I'm titling this episode, at least tentatively, "The Book of Mormon v. Joseph Smith," as a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek on the whole polygamy issue. Um, but we'll get into what the Book of Mormon has to say here. So Jacob chapter 1, we have the transition from Nephi to Jacob as the author, right? So Nephi gets old and dies,
As
um,
one does, you
as
know.
one does. Now this starts 55 years after Lehi had left Jerusalem, and that's where Nephi is going to, it gives the plates to Jacob 55
Mhm.
years after he left. So that means that Jacob would have been about 50 years old. I'm guessing that based off of the record, we have a 65 to 70-year-old Nephi at this point.
Okay.
So if we're so late at this point in time, I feel like I can talk about what RFM's doing on his side. Um,
Yes,
right.
please.
So yeah. So what RFM did his episode, we talked about like the math in this section. He was focusing, I think, largely up to Omni, and how the math of these generations doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Um, this age difference between Jacob and Nephi, I think, is kind of one of these places where we start to see like Jacob is 50 years old, and that's the point when he's being given the plates. Why wouldn't they
Like,
go to? Why aren't they given directly to Enos? Like I understand like the plates are being passed, the small plates are being passed along the prophetic line. Yeah, I don't know why Enos isn't maybe getting a little bit more time in the sun here, but um, you know,
it just
j-
logistically it doesn't really make that much sense. I guess it's like here you're already, I mean, for their time and obviously very real and historical place.
uh-huh.
um I mean, he's basically ancient, so
Right,
like,
right. I mean, now verse 9 says that Nephi began to be old. So this is after he's given the place, but I think
I
Nephi was
began that
already
years ago. Nephi, get with it.
and then we have this little passage here about Nephi having wielded the sword of Laban, which we talked a bit about what the sword of Laban would have been.
Yeah.
And I do find it unlikely that the sort of that if the Vera Jericho sword is anything to go off of for what the sword of Laban would have been, that Nephi's doing much wielding of it in combat for defense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, it's also, I mean, that is an interesting thing because the Book of Mormon has a population issue. And I would contend that whoever the author of the Book of Mormon is does not understand population mechanics.
I was gonna say
Um,
we need some people and not a lot of chicks, you know?
mhm. Well, I think it's one bride for one brother. I think we do get the seven brides for seven brothers by the time we're done with the whole
But then
Lehite children
later it's
Ishmael
seven
story,
brides for one brother.
and that's a
Oh,
and that's a little problematic, right? I mean, in verse 15, we get this whole thing about the Nephites desiring concubines and wives like those of old, and where are these wives and concubines coming from?
I have
Um,
questions. Was it like a manna thing where like chicks just fell from heaven?
right? I guess I like
Unleavened chicks.
so
Unleavened chicks.
unleavened chicks. So they don't. Never mind. I am not going to go there. um,
I'm so proud of you and your restraint.
I have to cut that one off before we get demonetized for this one. um,
Okay, moving on. So sorry. Clearly, I'm an adult.
I think that we never quite got past middle school in terms of the sense of humor here.
Oh,
Um,
very
so
much so.
I am struggling with this idea where we came into this podcast with the intent of letting the Book of Mormon really speak for itself, and
Yes.
for it to tell us what's going on, and for us to then take what it's saying, look at some scholarship, look at some textual analysis, versus what the Book of Mormon actually has to say, and see how that all stacks up. And in this particular section, we've got 50 years from when they've left Jerusalem. We have only mentioned the family of Lehi and the family of Ishmael traveling together, and then Zoram, right? So we have Zoram for a little genetic
Oh, forgot
diversity in
about
there.
Zoram. That's right.
Can't forget about Zoram.
What was I thinking? I'm so
It's all right.
sorry, Zoram.
Nephi forgot about Zoram too. It's like the end of that story. So everybody's forgetting about Zoram.
He just doesn't ever come back up again.
Like, it very, very rarely does Zoram. And Zoram does not factor into the story at all, really, until he gets mentioned here as being a progenitor of one line. And
Way to go, Zoram.
Right. So Jacob says that we have that the people who are not Lamanites are Nephites, and the Nephites include the Nephites, the Jacobites, the Josephites, and the Zoramites. Largely, as long as they're allied with the Nephites, that's who gets bundled under the people of Nephi. And then the Lamanites are the Lamanites, the Lemuelites, and the Ishmaelites. Potentially some of the Zoramites. There's like some indicate. So this is me doing something that I'm going to kind of chide critics for here in a minute, but I'm going to take something later and impose it on something earlier. But when you get to Alma, there's a group of people who call themselves the Zoramites because they follow a guy named Zoram. And this, again, is probably just a coincidence because Joseph was not necessarily creative with names. But that group of Zoramites is where we get one of the breakoff groups that then leads into the Amalekiah-Amoron Wars and the whole war chapter section. One of the pins that has to fall for that to happen.
Revenge of the Zoramites, are they any relation to the OG Zoramites?
See, that's one of the things that I'm not 100%, that I don't remember exactly. I think that the Zoram in Alma, if I'm recalling correctly, I'm going off of memory here, does claim to be a descendant of Zoram.
Okay.
I think. And if that's the case, then that would link this idea that there may have been a division in the Zoramites. It's interesting to me as well that you have just Ishmaelites, meaning the sons of Ishmael, like the descendants of the sons of Ishmael. They're never named. At no point in time does the author of the Book of Mormon go through to name the sons of Ishmael, so they just end up as Ishmaelites. And
which I'm sure they're totally fine with. I mean,
right.
Like you said, he didn't really work that well with names. So, I mean, maybe he just didn't have a lot of names.
As I recall, there is no point in which the sons of Ishmael are shown aligning themselves with Nephi. And so it would be pretty easy for this to be understood that they're part of the group that breaks off and goes with the Lamanites. And I'm imagining that if you're Joseph Smith, or if you're Joseph Smith and you're coming up with this story, and you want to say that the Lamanites are a larger population than the Nephites, which is what gets claimed later on, that going with the idea that you have Nephi, Jacob, and Joseph, not Sam, weirdly enough, but
I was like, wait a minute, we're missing a brother.
We are missing a brother. As one group, and then like a mix of the Zoramites, and then you have Laman, Lemuel, and multiple sons of Ishmael. That could then create a larger like base population for the Lamanites. But
I can see that.
But this is why apologists pretty quickly shifted to this idea that we kind of have to accept at least some of the Siberian migration theory
Yeah,
into the Americas, so that we have this other population for the Lehites to mix in with.
because we literally have 8 people.
Right. And then once the
So
DNA stuff starts to kick in, that becomes like huge. Like now at this point in time, this is such a minority population that they just disappear into the record.
so my question to you on this is, there's never really a yes, there were people here when the Lehites and the Nephites and the Lamanites and all the ites got here.
That's exactly my issue.
So
If we're
were
allowing the
there
Book of Mormon to speak for itself, there
people?
weren't any other people.
Okay,
And
so I'm not missing
now
that. So.
there is one little wrinkle in this. The Jaredites still exist at this point in time.
Okay.
Okay.
I still feel
so
like that's not enough for.
It's absolutely not enough. And we'll talk about this when we get to Omni, where they mention Coriantumr having dwelt with the Mulekites for 9 days, 9 moons, because we have to make it sound, indigenous American.
Scripture-y. Right.
Yeah. The issue is, at what point in time did Coriantumr dwell with the Mulekites? And that I don't think is ever made clear. It's some point before Mosiah's group, Mosiah the First group, contacts them. It's Mosiah the First that contacts the Mulekites. And it's some point there, but it's not really clear when exactly that particular contact between Coriantumr and that group actually occurred. It is at the least a tradition that the Mulekites hold when they are talking to Mosiah the First, and the Mulekites would have arrived in the at about the same time that the Lehites do. They're another migration that happens, right? They're descended from one of the sons of Zedekiah, and basically whatever people that son of Zedekiah would have had in his entourage coming over.
I guess it's super confusing to me, because we go from there being like 8 people and continents, and then it's not that much later in the story that all of a sudden we have like all these different peoples, and there's just there's no way. Like, there's no way.
Right. So, like I said, the author of the Book of Mormon does not understand population mechanics. Just plain and simple. This happens multiple times throughout the text. Right. The author of the Book of Mormon does not understand how populations work. And it's going to be evidenced here. It's evidenced in the war chapters. It's throughout the text. There is no point in time where the author of the Book of Mormon really grasps how a population actually functions. And what this does resemble, though, is if you recall the story of Noah, and you have the destruction of all the, like, everybody on the planet, right? Everybody dies, and then except for the 8 people that are on the ark. And then they go out, and you have 3 lines. You have the Hamites, the Shemites, and the Japhethites that come from the, and then those become all the various peoples in the world. And then pretty shortly thereafter, you have the story of the Tower of Babel. And somehow, some way, you have a sufficiently large population to construct a very large tower, like a large ziggurat. And then you have enough people that you can mess with languages, and those people will disperse.
Oh, silly Perry, that's Jesus magic. You know how that works. Come on.
So what I'm seeing in this, though, is you're getting echoes of the same type of storytelling. So what this really resembles is the author of the Book of Mormon was familiar with the Pentateuch and that particular those particular stories, and was using those same types of ideas to construct this origin myth. And I think that's the best way of actually understanding what the Book of Mormon is saying, because anything else imposes on it something that it's not actually doing.
I stand by that.
Yeah.
I co-sign there. That makes sense.
And if you're wanting to take an apologetic position, you have to have some population for these groups to blend into, and then you have to go through some weird like genetic argument that the Lamanites were interbreeding in more with the indigenous peoples and were therefore darker skinned, and then
Because you
the
end up with like
Nephites
the
weren't
hills
like
have eyes. If you
yeah
don't,
yeah
I just like
um it
some
yeah
point.
and there's some racism issues baked into that whole hypothesis too because of how it describes the Lamanites living. It's a thing.
Like the
What I
Habsburgs, it didn't work out for them. So I just feel like there needs to be some fresh blood, guys.
there and that is yeah, that's definitely the case. I have a I've had some back and forth with a an apologist or a believer, not really an apologist, a believer who was arguing that the population math or the generation math in the Book of Mormon makes sense because the people lived longer back then. And I'm like, this is 600. This is like post 600 BC. This is like pre-exile, first temple.
Yeah, no, this is
Like this is we're so far removed from the Noahic stuff. You can't even
yeah,
argue like based off of that. That's not making any
bro,
sense at
these
all.
people are practically driving. This is
Yeah.
more recent history.
We are closer to these people than they were to the flood. It's not
Right.
quite that bad.
Like,
But almost.
that makes me happy. Thank you for
Yeah.
that, Perry. I just at some point they just the apologists have to go to such incredible lengths that
Yeah.
it's almost entertaining.
Yeah. It's
It is entertaining to
but
watch
you'll
the
see this
leaps.
you will see those leaps throughout like apologetics. So it's not just Mormon
Yeah.
apologetics where that those sorts of logical leaps are an issue. Seriously, answers in Genesis for like the defending the
Yep.
flood is hilarious, especially when you
Yep.
bring up the heat problem. By the way, if your relatives are ever bringing up like the Noahic flood, just mention the heat problem and invite them to look it up. There's no answer to the heat problem except for God magic, and it's great because it just moves it so far outside of the realm of any sort of like this could have actually happened. It's yeah.
Well, Perry, we found the ark. It's on Mount Ararat. What are
Right.
you talking
I
about?
love the Ron Wyatt claims. They're great. It's the same sort of archaeology that we've seen with like the how did the gold plates from Saudi Arabia come up when we were doing I think that they came up during our break.
It came up during the break.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's like another example of like this whole like Ron Wyatt style like absolutely meaningless find. You appear to be
Oh, hey,
frozen, my
Perry, I think
friend. Are we experiencing an issue? I'm
we
gonna
lost
pause
you,
here.
Perry.
I'm gonna pause real.
Don't worry,
All
Perry. I
right.
explained. I explained to our audience that you were so excited about this, the plates from Saudi Arabia, that you began glitching in real life, which is further proof that we all live in a matrix. Please carry on.
I'm curious because I think what StreamYard is going to do is it's going to combine our recordings together, so they should see something hopefully somewhat seamless with us just suddenly freaking out.
Which is normal. We totally freak out on the reg. So this is not.
We do. That's actually pretty consistent with our overall experience here in our podcast series.
I'd be more concerned if we weren't freaking out about something.
Business as usual.
Exactly.
Yeah, so no, so those plates in Saudi Arabia end up being like a fine kind of a la Ron Wyatt, where it's just like obvious fraud, like just an obvious forgery.
Clearly.
And man, they flipped out about it for a while. And I really do appreciate, and this is gonna be the Dan McClellan plug for the day. I really do appreciate Dan McClellan's videos on that because I think that coming from an LDS scholar. And saying like, guys, like this ain't it is
I didn't
Pretty
understand why
important.
the QR code on the back that got you 20% off at Domino's wasn't kind of a giveaway, but
You know, I mean, the time that through the power of the Urim Thummim that you could actually produce a QR coupon code.
it worked. I got 35% off. Thank you. Jesus chicken and
Um,
Jesus pizza. Let's go.
Perfect. Let's see. So before we got distracted by we were talking about the really how like the population mechanics with the flood are
Yeah,
very
doesn't
similar to what we're seeing here in this origin myth for that's in the Book of Mormon. Um, and again, throughout the text, the Bible does not understand population mechanics either. That's why we end up with a large scale exodus. That's why we end up with conquest. That's why we end up with like these ridiculously large battles that definitely did not happen at that scale. Throughout, it's throughout the Bible, right?
yeah,
And
it's
the Book of
like
Mormon has the same issue. And I would say that where the Book of Mormon narrative really comes up short with understanding how the real world works is in echoes to the Bible.
yeah,
And so I don't think it's coming out of left field either. So it's not like I don't think that the author of the Book of Mormon is coming up with this story and it's just pure fabrication from the mind. I think that it's inspired
right.
from the Bible. It's taking those ideas, it's synthesizing them into this story, and it's producing the exact same problems that you would see in the biblical
Well, if
text.
that's if I mean if you go back to it and look at it through the lens of a child making up a story or writing a story based off of really the main source of literature that he has, it
Mm-hmm.
makes sense why you would have those same reoccurring problems in the Book of Mormon as you would in the Bible, because it kind of just
Right.
shows that this is where the guy's getting his source material from.
Right. Right. If there were other like significant influences to the Book of Mormon, at least to its narrative, um, I would think that the mistakes would look different. Because I think it's exactly right. You have a first-time writer making errors in what they're writing based off of what they know, and
Right,
when it's the Bible, that's they're making those sorts of errors. Um,
right.
I think that that's exactly what the text is showing us.
My camera was doing something strange, so I'm just resetting it. You're good. I'm
And
still here.
I was doing the neuroatypical thing of fidgeting, and then I just dropped it. So
It's
hopefully the
fine.
microphone did not pick that up. Uh,
I heard it.
so
We all heard it, Perry. We all
dang
heard it.
it! Now I'm embarrassed. Um, so the other thing that comes up in this section is polygamy, and I do find this telling that the so early on in the Mormon ministry, polygamy is an issue that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am far from the first person to note that. I'll be far from the last person to note that. It's just one of those things that has been recognized as a bit of a curiosity for a long time. Um,
There we go.
what I find of note is that the text is in opposition to what Joseph Smith is going to do later on. It's rather strictly in opposition to that. And it does cut out this little caveat that is really intended to excuse what David and Solomon were doing,
Right,
not necessarily to justify what Joseph Smith would later do. But Joseph Smith
right,
will kind of, I don't know if he's consciously using that because I don't know how much he actually cared about what the Book of Mormon said. Um,
right,
but he will more or less use that cutout to create an idea that, hey, we can actually do a polygamy now. And
right,
that's really
right,
the basis of the happiness letter, right? So the happiness letter makes this whole argument that what God commands in one case might not, he might command the opposite in another situation. What's right here may not be right over there because we're going to do divine command theory. And so, don't kill, but hey, go and kill all of the babies is what God is saying.
and
And
you can't forget about the totally justified murder of Laban. I mean,
right, right,
elimination
right.
of Laban. Yeah, it wasn't murder
A
because
whole other
murder's
case. So,
bad.
So I don't know how much you follow like sort what goes on in like Christian apologetics, but William Lane Craig, one of like the top like Christian apologists out there, has come up with actually like, or has championed one of the more interesting arguments for the existence of God. And I would actually like to do a video about how that
Ooh.
fits into Mormonism at some point in time. Anyway, um, he sat down with an atheist, Alex O'Connor,
Okay.
on that channel. They did an interview together, and Alex O'Connor was pushing William Lane Craig on the genocide of the Amalekites, in particular the slaughter of the Amalekite children.
Yep.
Maybe the Canaanites. Anyway, there are multiple genocides in the Old Testament, and
I
so
was gonna
with
say,
children death.
which
So
genocide?
so
So
take
it
your pick.
doesn't.
Um,
Right.
and William Lane Craig defended that using the same logic that Joseph Smith uses to justify doing polygamy. It's built
That's
into this divine
awesome.
command theory. It's built into like this idea that what God commands is right. Therefore, if God
I love
commands to do a bad thing,
Christianity. It's so
right?
fun.
What's interesting with that, and this is not the tangent I meant to go down, but what's interesting with that is that Mormonism has this conflict where it wants divine command theory to be a thing, but then because we have this divine potential and this
Mhm.
this ability to become gods, you also have to go with this idea that morality, what's good and right, exists outside of God. That there is
Right.
a
Okay.
law irrevocably decreed in heaven, right? It cannot be changed. All blessings are predicated upon the obedience to that law. Um, Therefore, divine command
Sure.
theory doesn't work because God can't just willy-nilly command what he wants to. What God commands isn't good and right. What's good and right is good and right, and God has to give commands that are consistent with that. And there's this tension and conflict in those ideas, and yeah, you can see people like they'll go back and forth on that, and they're not going to think about it. And I found that just about every time I push a Mormon believer or apologist on like the youth throw dilemma about the idea of like where does good come from? Does good come from the gods, or does it already exist and the gods command that which is good? So like
Right.
right, that's what the youth throw dilemma is all about. When I push them on that, they get seriously contemplative, and then like that's an interesting question, and that's really as far as the conversation goes because there isn't an answer that's consistent in Mormonism.
Right.
Scott on Ramyampton Ruminations did a whole like series of episodes on divine command theory and how that lines up in Mormonism, and kind of came to some similar conclusions. I think if I recall correctly, he took the position that Mormonism favors divine command theory,
Okay.
but with asterisks and caveats. And I have a slightly different position from or slightly different conclusion from it than what he had. But anyway, really good episodes. If you dig through the catalog on Ramyampton Ruminations, where he dove into divine command theory, I think it's a good listen. Yeah,
I was
anyway, that
really
was not the digression I was meant to
enjoying.
go down.
No, it was a solid one though, because that, I will tell you, uh, as I have been and becoming more familiar with different podcasts like RFM, like all of them. Oh my gosh, I feel so bad. John.
John Dehlin or John Larson?
Thank you. Yeah, both, really. But as I've been going down this Mormon stories, John. God bless.
Yeah.
What is his
Well,
name?
the problem is that they both worked together for so long, but John Dehlin is the one you mean.
I know, and that's not helpful either. I realize that I'm talking to myself anyway. So as I have been going down this rabbit hole, watching this podcast, and then this next one is suggested, and then don't forget to check out this. But I will spend hours, and all of a sudden it's like nighttime, and I'm like,
mm-hmm.
it's fascinating to me how all of this was not more prevalent to myself, and I mean to
Yeah.
I did not see all of this back when I was the apologetic,
And this is why I say that, like, I have come to love this tradition so much more as a critic than I did as a believer. It is
Yes.
endlessly fascinating to me now, and the way that I'm able to just explore it, and like whatever the answers are is what the answers are, just
Right.
makes it endlessly fascinating. I love it.
Yes.
Yeah, I love it in a way that I don't think that I could as a believer. Um, which is pretty great. It's pretty great.
Well, I think it's because from this side of the lens, they're humans.
Mhm.
We're seeing them, but we're seeing them with the flaws and everything that makes them the flawed individuals that they are. When you're active in the church, they're sort of held so much higher above you, and it's hard to see them for the humans that they were.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not explaining it very well. I think it makes them a little more real
Yeah.
on this side of the thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think grounding people, whether it's the biblical figures, whether it's the Book of Mormon figures, whether it's the literal people who actually existed in history, such as Joseph Smith, Brigham
Right.
Young, and others, grounding them in the sense of reality, but also what they are intended to be, or what they were, by their authors, by their creators, or however, whichever group you're talking about.
Mm,
I think that seeing the reality of what these figures are is, um, it's liberating, but it also speaks to the human condition, I think, in a really
yeah.
profound way. Um, yeah, and yeah, it's endlessly fascinating. There is always something new, and when you don't have to be afraid
Yes.
of what the answers are, oh,
Yes. That's You
yeah.
nailed it. That's what it is I was always so afraid to deep dive earlier in
Mhm.
my journey because maybe I wasn't gonna like what I was gonna find.
That's
And
why you.
now
Yep,
it's not so
yep.
scary.
You remember getting warned against, like, consuming anti-material, but now who's warning you about consuming faithful material? Like, go listen
Exactly.
to the faithful thing, like, whatever, like,
Yes.
just
Compare it.
yeah, just take with it the same amount of skepticism that you would apply to any other claim,
Yeah.
and have fun. Enjoy it. It's really
Right.
fascinating and interesting. Um, yeah,
I don't know what's
I
happening with my camera. I want you to understand that I'm so sorry.
It's alright, it's alright. Every once in a while, you're just a circle person. Um
I was like, I'm sitting here. I don't understand what I've done wrong. I just I needed a moment away from the limelight, Mr.
Right.
DeVille.
So, to the point of what you were just saying, though, about, like, treating these people as though they're real people, I on this podcast, we talk a lot about, like, the bad arguments that, apologists and believers are putting forward. I wanna talk for a minute about the bad arguments that, critics have been putting forward, and I've seen this come up in a couple places lately, and I'm hoping to, at some point in time, do a response to, the Lars Nielsen, interview on Mormonism Live,
Mhm.
um, and with his book
Yes.
about, the how the Book of Mormon came to pass. Um, I and there's just been some things that have come up in critical spaces lately that I feel the need to kind of call out, because while there's this tendency,
Preach.
for instance, in Jacob chapter 2, you've got the whole, like, admonition, the
Yeah.
prescribing of, of, polygamy. Um, and then, like, there's people who will, like, try to connect Joseph Smith's later polygamy to this earlier prescribing of polygamy in some weird
Mhm.
roundabout way. Um, there have been efforts by some critics to tie in ideas that exist in later Mormonism as somehow explanations for the origins of the Book of Mormon, and it
Yeah.
drives me crazy. The Book of Mormon, for instance, is anti-Masonic. It is an anti-Masonic book. It is the treatise on
Mhm.
anti-Masonry. This is how it gets characterized. I think it's Alexander Campbell, actually, that called it, like, in part an answer to, like, anti-Masonry, because it's what it
Yeah.
is. It is an anti-Masonic text. So if you want to argue that because Joseph Smith later did a Masonry, that somehow the Book of Mormon is actually pro-Masonic or comes from a Masonic source, you're arguing it wrong. Stop
still
it.
doesn't change anything, friends.
Like, and I'm bringing this up because people have done this. They have said,
Yeah.
hey, because the Book of Mormon has this because Joseph Smith later did a Masonry, clearly the Book of Mormon and Book of Mormon discusses Masonry. Clearly it's meant to be Masonic. It's not.
It's got to be pro. It's like, nope. Did you read it? Did you read the things?
So where do the conversation about Masonry come from? We're going to deal with this later on more specifically, but it's just really important to remember that anti-Masonry was really a big deal in 1820s, early 1830s, New England. Like it is a big deal. And the Book of Mormon fits neatly into that milieu. It's answering questions that were common to that time. And one of those questions was the question about Masonry. And it comes down with a big thumbs down when it comes to Masonic stuff. That Joseph later does a Masonry is irrelevant to what the Book of Mormon itself does, or what Joseph Smith is arguing at the time of the production of the Book of Mormon. These things are not connected. Okay? I need to make that clear. Another thing that keeps coming up. I've heard critics say that Nephi is meant to be autobiographical of Joseph Smith. He is not autobiographical. That there are common elements between the two is interesting. So have you watched Sword Art Online? I know you watch some like anime. Have you watched Sword Art Online by chance?
Yes.
Okay.
A little bit.
Have you watched Sword Art Online Abridged? Because if not, you should. It's way better.
That's what my brother said too. So
yeah. Don't watch Sword Art Online. Just for the record, like don't watch Sword Art Online. It's bad. Watch Sword Art Online Abridged. It's funny for one, and it's actually a better version of the same story. Anyway,
that's what my brother said.
So Sword Art Online, you have Kirito, and he's like, this super awesome, like he's super great at video games, and he gets the girl, and he's all really, really great and fantastic and intelligent and the best and all of that. Well, that's because he's a self-insert character for the author Reki Kawahara, right? Like he is putting himself into the story in this like look in this wish fulfillment sort of way, like in this fantasy that he has about like doing a super cool thing. Nephi is Joseph Smith's Kirito. It's not biographical. We're not saying that Reki Kawahara did anything that Kirito was doing. What we're saying is that Reki Kawahara is trying to put himself into this fantasy, and Joseph Smith is trying to put himself into this fantasy with Nephi.
He wants to be Nephi. He is not.
He wants to be. He wants to be. And so, like, people will talk about, or one of the things that comes up is like how how Lucy Mack basically describes Joseph Sr. as having a version of the vision of the Tree of Life that Lehi has, right? Well, Nephi goes in to see the same vision and then has commentary on it that would contradict what Joseph Smith Sr.'s version of that was based off of Lucy Mack Smith's account of the same thing, right? So we're going off of her accounting of it, and then Joseph Smith's or Nephi's version of that vision seems to contradict Joseph Sr.'s interpretation of the same. In other words, what we could see that as is Joseph Smith wishing that he had said this to his father, wishing that he had a way of conveying this information to his father, and then doing that through Nephi.
Right.
It's self-insert. It's that's what this is. If you're going to argue that Nephi is Joseph Smith, understand that what you're doing is it's not autobiographical. You can't fit the actual experiences of Joseph Smith's life into the story. What you can do is do what Joseph Smith wishes he had done.
Wishes he could do, yeah. He wants to be the one that can commune with God and be this hero.
And cut off the bad guy's head and wield his sword and, break the bindings or whatever, right? Like these are, but then to be like humbled by God. Like he also sees himself anyway.
Yeah.
It's wish fulfillment.
I'm on board.
I'm on board. Like Nephi is so full of himself because it's Joseph Smith's like wish fulfillment, self-insert character,
Right.
not an autobiographical character. And
Right,
if you
exactly.
want the why this is not autobiographical, where is Alvin in the story?
Oh,
Right? This is the thing for me that's like, where's Alvin? If this is autobiographical, we would have an Alvin character.
oh,
And we don't. So,
that's true. Yeah, I never even
and
thought
like,
about that.
yeah. It's yeah. The whole thing with like the sibling relationships ultimately doesn't actually make sense when you start to try to map it onto being autobiographical. The closest you can get is there's some similarities between how Nephi and Lehi interact with each other to how Joseph
Yeah,
Sr. and Joseph Jr. interact. It's not autobiographical. That is my
no,
soapbox on that. Basically, don't apply later Joseph Smith actions to the naturalistic origins of the Book of Mormon, especially if the Book of Mormon is in conflict
yeah,
with whatever it is that Joseph Smith does later on. What that does is it marginalizes the trauma of Liberty Jail, and we as
yeah,
critics need to emphasize a lot more, or at least start looking at a lot more, the impact of Liberty Jail on the Nauvoo period. I think that we've done
yeah.
a poor job of discussing that, and what I will do is invite you to find me some number of podcasts, some number of ex-Mormon podcasts that actually discuss Liberty Jail. And you're going to find very, very few. You'll find a ton about
Yeah.
polygamy. You'll find a ton about Book of Mormon origins. You'll find quite a bit about like the Kirtland Banking Society or the Kirtland Anti-Banking Society. You'll find stuff about that. You're not really going to
Yeah.
find a whole lot about Liberty Jail in the critical spaces, which is unfortunate.
Which surprises me really because
Yep.
I mean, even as a faithful, active member of the church, nobody ever really discussed or brought up what they went through in Liberty Jail. Like, I even went to Liberty Jail, and when I saw it, I was like, well, this is horrible. Like, this is very traumatizing. And
Mm-hmm.
even in the tour, they didn't really bring up how horrific that was and the lasting effect it would have.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that you get Joseph coming back and seems to be like better than ever, right? Like he gets to Nauvoo and he is putting on this face, his game face, and
Yeah.
he is rocking and rolling in Nauvoo. He's also dressing up like a general. He's also parading around the street, assuming all sorts of power. Like he's doing all this stuff to consolidate power to himself, acting like a spoiled child because of the trauma that undoubtedly, brought up like the childhood trauma that probably inspired the Book of Mormon in the first case. Anyway, I think that we can't sit and like do the whole like armchair diagnosis of historical figures and all of that. And so we have to take it in stride. But I think that if we understand Joseph Smith through the lens of a traumatized child who grows up to be a traumatized adult, who goes through significant trauma through 1836, from 1836 through 1838, especially, we get the whole map. You get the whole like kind of everything, and his worst tendencies getting brought out through all of that. And it's not that there aren't other traumas earlier that would have actually exacerbated the problem or kind of created some of those initial wounds. But man, I think we underestimate just how much of an impact Liberty Jail would have had, especially considering how that broke. I'm pretty sure it's Cindy Riggin that it just broke, just shattered.
Well, and it's interesting because it's all connected. One of my favorite podcasts, which has nothing to do with Mormonism or religion, it's called Astonishing Legends. Anyway, it's about Bigfoot and aliens because they're just as real as anything else. So that most religious podcasts talk about. So their famous line is, "It's all connected."
It's all connected.
And so I'm gonna take a line from them. It's all connected, man. If you go with the Mosiah the
Messiah
Mosiah
priority.
theory, yes, thank you. If you go with that and then add in Liberty Jail and then look at how things in DNC shift, there's legitimately no way that you could refute that he's
You can map
there
it all.
is yeah, there is some massive brain trauma happening there.
But what you can't do is you can't take the masonry that he does after
No.
Liberty Jail and say that that is in any way an impact in the origins of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah,
Like,
no.
where the Book of Mormon contradicts Joseph Smith's later actions, and I'm bringing this up because of the polygamy discussion here in Jacob 2, where the Book of Mormon contradicts Joseph's later actions, you can't use those later actions to then justify the Book of Mormon's origins. That's not how it works. You have to map, and you have to take in, like, there's this progression of Joseph that we have in terms of written record. Like I said, we start with Mosiah. If that's where the written record really starts, with Joseph. And then you're going to lead all the way in until you hit Liberty Jail. And I see that as this tipping point. He could have gone either way, and then he just tips in this other direction because of Liberty Jail. And
I stand with that. That's
we can have a discussion. Like, if this were a church history podcast, you could have the discussion about, like, Fanny Alger and where, like, all the pre-Liberty shenanigans fit into all of this. And my point isn't that Joseph didn't have tendencies, didn't have these sorts of, like, proclivities before Liberty Jail. It's that Liberty Jail is the thing that tips him fully over. It unlocks all of his worst tendencies. It brings in the megalomania and all the other stuff that we see Joseph doing in Nauvoo that's kind of seeded before. That's the thing that actually grows that particular tree, that nurtures that particular tree, and we see that it is not the best of fruit.
You mean super white, blonde, blue-eyed fruit? I mean, what? It's interesting to me because you see it in history over and over and over again, where these people that, maybe flirt with things that go against their belief systems, but then you add in a trauma, whether it's a childhood trauma or an adult trauma or a horrible accident where there's head damage, and then you see them kind of make this massive shift after. Guys, I mean, if anything, I think, just come on, there's no way that that's not what happened with him.
A parallel example to this is if you remember from the documentary about the Heaven's Gate cult. And how
Applewhite.
Is it so you have T and Doe, and is it T that dies and then Doe that goes nuts? I'm trying to remember which one's which.
So T is the only reason I'm so well versed on this is because I'm a weirdo who watches true crime, but also I just watched a documentary about this legitimately yesterday. So T and Doe is Applewhite, and T is the chick.
Okay, so T is the one who dies. I know it's her that dies, and then
she dies. Yes.
Yeah, and then he loses it after that.
Yes.
Like, just that sense, that profound sense of loss. And all of his worst instincts that you can see seeds of before come to the forefront. And I think that Liberty Jail for Joseph is the same thing.
Yeah, the T dying.
Yeah. And this is where critics, as critics, we need to be careful in understanding that and quit. Anyway, my soapbox on that is we need to quit taking stuff that happens later and imposing it on the origins of the Book of Mormon. They're separate events.
Yes.
You can. I think that if you to make a little bit of a shift there, William Davis was just on Mormonism with the Murph talking about some naturalistic origin theories for the Book of Mormon. He puts forward, like, the laying down heads idea, and makes a really good case for that. to the point that I think that it at least accounts for some, if not most, of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
We can get into like some stuff with all that. We should do a Book of Mormon origins theories, like
Yes.
evaluation episode. Anyway,
I still stand by automatic writing, but
so yeah, I do too, with some new caveats actually after this was
I
pretty
think
informative.
Joseph waked and baked and found a hat and got some
um,
rocks and made a religion.
I think that there is some truth to that. But
That is not
what
the opinion of anybody
yeah.
but me. I'm just saying.
One of the things that they were talking about in their latest episode was about Joseph Smith's memory, and how how he could has the capability most likely to like memorize the 30 Jaredite kings, and to be able to then use that. And he kind of points to some stuff that shows up in Doctrine and Covenants that you could use to substantiate that. And it's like stuff that's like in 1831 and 1832. What we have there is we have a concordance of what's happening in the Book of Mormon with the thing that happens slightly later. And we're talking about just Joseph Smith's skill set. In that case, you can use what happens later as a way of sort of informing what happened before, because you have things, they're aligned, they're concording with each other, you're making a relatively small claim, and all of that, right? So you're talking about skill set. When you're talking about stuff that's in direct opposition and it's much later, that's where my issues come in. So I want to make that distinction that I think you can use stuff later on as like an evidence to say, hey, like Joseph Smith apparently had the skill set. We can look later on and say, hey, he had the skill set. He could have brought this to the Book of Mormon. That's one thing.
Right.
But saying the Book of Mormon comes from a Masonic source because Joseph Smith did Masonry later on, when the Book of Mormon is anti-Masonic, that's a whole other. And I want to make that distinction, and hopefully that's clear at this point in time.
And so, trauma or no trauma, Joseph Smith is the same person in the beginning, during, and after the trauma that happened. So he's not going to all of a sudden have this trauma and turn, have a completely different writing style and a completely different everything. He's the same base person. He's just the same base person without those inhibitions anymore.
Right. And so the idea that the Book of Mormon that looks a lot like stuff that Joseph Smith writes later on comes from Solomon Spaulding or something else just doesn't stack. Right.
Doesn't, because it's the same. It's not everything didn't suddenly change,
Yeah. Yep. I'm with that. Yeah, I'm with that.
I feel like I just said the exact same thing you did. I just said it dumber. So
I think we're on the same page. I think that we're on the same page with that. So, all right. I think that covers what I wanted to do with Jacob 1 through 4. We're gonna pop this video out for you guys nice and soon, and then we're gonna release our next episode. Excuse me, on Jacob 5 through 7 here nice and soon, because we're trying to play catch up here and get back on schedule with y'all. So stay tuned for that. And until then, Lolo, it's been a pleasure. We'll see you next time.